Welcome back to the Master Series. Today we're going to study Joaquín Sorolla. In just 30 seconds, I'm going to introduce the artist to you, and then we're going to get right to the painting. If you want to know how to paint light, you study Joaquín Sorolla. Just look at this guy standing on the beach, sunscreens around him, umbrella above. He is in a three-piece suit, and he is painting the life, the people, the beasts of burden, the children on the beach, the women on the beach, the fishermen in their nets, the boats going in and out, but mostly he's painting the light. And he paints the light with a beauty and a sensitivity and a range of colors that is more instructive than any artist I've ever seen. If you want to learn to paint light, you need to study Joaquín Sorolla. And that's what we're going to do today. So let's get to it. Hey friends. Today we're going to use Sorolla as our inspiration, and I'm going to do the fastest tutorial I've ever done on painting light. Here we go. In the beginning, there was the darkness, and then there was light. Anytime we have a very controlled lighting situation like this, you've got the color of the light mixing with the color of the object. You're going to have soft edges here because this is a curved object. This is going to be a sphere. If it were a cube, you'd have harder edges, and we deal with that a little differently, but basically you've just got that light and the color of the object. Those mix and create the shape. They create the color. Then we can add, like, let's say, a little red wall. That red wall is going to cause light to bounce off of it onto the object, and you're going to get some fill in the backside into that shadow. Let's add another wall. So now we have light bouncing off of two surfaces, and it's getting this fullness of color wrapping around this sphere. What I like about this is with Rebelle, it's such a great and realistic painting tool that I can have the color of the light, the color of the wall, and I can simply mix those two to get this nice pinkish tone here, which you can see there. I can then take the color of the light, color of the wall, get the mix. You can see that here. And then you can take the color of the wall and color of the wall and get the mix. And you can see that here. So then I can round out all my color tones. I can do it with realistic color mixing, and I can start to create an interesting studio lighting situation, which is using just bounce lights and one light source. But how does this work if we go out into nature? Well, it's totally different, right? There's us. We're going to paint some boat in the sea, and we have the skylight, and we also have the sunlight. So the sunlight acts as our light source, the skylight acts as our fill, and we have this kind of complicated situation. We can't just do this, which is what a lot of people do. They paint like, say this like a beige or brown color. We're going to paint it light facing the sun, and then we're going to paint it dark facing away from the sun. If you look at Sorolla's boat, that's not how it works. It's totally different. So what does he do? What he has to do when painting in nature, like all plein air artists have to, you have to get your direct light, specular highlights, and your highlight and you know your light shapes here. Then you've got your shadows and your core shadows and all that. But it's much more complicated because the colors are going to be influenced by the dome of the sky, the reflections on the water, and you're going to get all of that stuff bouncing and mixing into the sphere shapes or the sail shapes or the hull shapes. And you can see here in the Sorolla painting, he has lavender and ochres and kind of orangish colors and yellowish colors and beigeish colors and greens, and all of these colors are filtering into and coloring in the shadow. This is all shadow. And even on the hull of the boat, there's all this color. In the water, there's all this color. Anywhere where there's shadow, he's capturing not just the value, but also the tone, temperature, and color, right? It's amazing. So from Sorolla, we can know something really, really special about light. So I often have students, and when I'm doing instruction, they'll say, "How do I paint an ear?" And I'll say, "There is no ear." They'll say, "How do I paint water?" I'll say, "There is no water." And they'll say, "What are you talking about?" I'll say, "There's just the divine light." So that's what we learned from Sorolla. So let's jump into our painting. Jumping right into the portrait, I want to show you these guides that you see on the canvas. They are directly related to the guides that are on the reference image. Now, that reference image, I have a guide going from edge of glasses to edge of glasses, edge of eye to edge of eye, edge of nose to edge of nose, and so on. And then I can use those guides to make sure I have a perfect proportion in my drawing. So I'm using a watercolor, brush for my drawing. And I do that because I don't want to be too focused on perfection. I want it to be loose. I want it to be fluid. I want it to be feeling based, right? I believe that portraiture is a lot about feeling. Even though accuracy is important, proportions are very, very important, and it won't look like the person unless you get those proportions right. I still think, the portraiture is about feeling. So that's why I use watercolor underpainting. It also replicates what I like to do with real oils, which this is going to be an oil painting. In real oils, I like to get really a lot of turpentine and make my paint really loose and just rough in the very broad idea of what I'm going to paint. So that's what I've done here, and I've done it with the watercolor brush. What you can see is that Rebelle has this beautiful way of letting natural media be natural, of wet media be wet, but it also has amazing tools for color. What you can see over on the color palette, underneath I have 3 sliders. I have one for H is for hue, S is for saturation, L is for lightness. And usually I use HSV, but this time when I'm doing today, I'm focusing on color because of Sorolla, so color in the shadow. We can use a little trick. We can find, using the color picker, we can grab a color from our reference. Then what we can do is use the saturation slider, and we can slide our saturation up. What that's going to do is amazing. What it does is it actually transitions our color from this dark, murky gray to like purple, to red, to pink, to blue, to green. And what we're doing is we're keeping the value exactly the same, but we're changing the saturation, right? We can even change the hue. So we can say, gosh, that shadow is kind of like a creamy orangish color, but we can put any color we want, right? As long as it retains the value. And this is something that we need to learn when we paint, is that value is more important than color, but color is what brings the lighting to life. So what I've done here is the shadows, the light, the painting won't work unless the values are accurate. But once they are, you can tinker with the hue. You can tinker with the saturation as much as you want, as long as the lightness stays correct. So that HSL is a really nice setup for doing what I'm doing right now, which is doing some audacious and ridiculous things with my painting. And you're looking at this going like, why are you doing this? This is crazy. But just let me do this. I promise you it'll work out, and it's going to be really, really fun. I'm trying to create kind of a hodgepodge of underpainting colors full of really high saturation mark making. And then I'm building my more neutral tones on top of it. Now, this is kind of a cool technique, and there's a lot of artists that do this kind of all the time. They'll take a picture of an apple, or take a picture of a sink, or take a picture of their bathtub, or they take a picture, in the garden, and then they go in and, they'll even color pick the values. They'll color pick what's going on in the scene, and then they'll just boost the saturation, just like I'm showing you. And the whole painting has this kind of like high saturation neon vibe to it, but the values are accurate, so it reads. And it's really fun to look at because it's like the colors are out of this world. And I sort of did an underpainting with that technique, inspired by Joaquín Sorolla, taking some of those greens, some of those purples, some of those lavenders, some of those ochres, and pushing those into the shadows of the face. And this is by design. This is also something that is really crucial because of this photo I chose. I really, really, really wanted to pick a reference picture, where the colors were really vivid and bright and saturated in the shadow, just like I see with Sorolla all the time. So for me, there's not only a lot of similar colors in this picture as there is to the boat up above, but it also has that similar saturation in the shadows that just make this so much like a Sorolla painting. So with that said, I think we're well on our way now with our underpainting, with our reference guides, with our loose watercolor underneath. Now we're building up with oil brushes and we're just putting in big strokes, trying to find our shapes, trying to make sure our values are right, playing with our saturation a little bit, playing with our lightness a little bit to just see if we can get that right feel. And I think it's on its way. It's feeling pretty close. I'm also really intentionally trying to leave little pockets of that high saturation underpainting showing through. I think it just looks cool. And I think it's a fun experiment. I think with, here's a little an antidote from when I was painting with my mentor when I was a kid. He would often have like these lavender areas when we'd be out painting in the forest, and we'd say, there's no purple trees, and he would say, well, if it's the same value, right, as the green of the forest, it'll read. And it always did. In fact, it made the forest look more beautiful to have these greens and lavenders all mixed in together. And so using that same kind of concept, I'm pushing some of these variations, some of these colors that are there, but I'm pushing them really, really hard in terms of their saturation, pushing them really, really hard in terms of the hue, but keeping that value just right. So it reads really nicely, even if it's way exaggerated. So with that said, I'm going to zoom in here and start to play with detail for the first time. And, I guess at this point, without it being fast forwarded or time lapsed, I'm about an hour into the painting, and it's been a fun one. It's been a lot of experimentation. I'm playing with color. I'm playing with saturation, playing with hue, and I really like it. I think it has some semblance of the kind of freedom and character of a Sorolla painting. His studies had the most wild brushstrokes. And I love looking at his studies. In fact, sometimes, not just with him, but with most artists, you'll see their studies almost have more beautiful, wild brushstrokes. There's a freedom in the studies that is hard to keep in the final studio paintings. So if you ever get a chance to, go to a museum or go to Sorolla's house or look at some of his books, I have one in particular that does a good job of this. There's like, on one side of the page, there's his final painting. On the other side of the page, it's like his study, and you can see and compare the two. And a lot of times the freshness of the study that was done on the beach is better than it is in the kind of final form, because it's got more of that freedom in it. So painting is, it's about a lot of things. It's about technical stuff like proportion and placement and composition and design and color harmonies and understanding, all that stuff. But it's also, it's about feeling, and it's about the bravado of brushstrokes or the character that you bring with your mark making. It's about capturing the essence of a person. It's about finding your particular approach based on what you're trying to say with the piece. And so there's a lot that goes into it. So just, enjoy the process, study as much as you can. I would recommend always looking at Sorolla, buying his books, having his library of images on your computer somewhere so that you can always study. Almost anytime I feel kind of like my work is flat or it's boring or it's just not alive enough, I will pull some Sorolla references in to whatever I'm working on just to bring like that vivacious energy of the living light into my work. And I love especially how his use of color emphasizes the kind of quality of light that is so unique on planet Earth. And I'm sure, if I grew up in Valencia, Spain, I would know it even more. But you can see here some of the brushwork, a lot of the color, and the use of light and dark is very, very inspired by Sorolla. So just want to thank Joaquín Sorolla for the huge inspiration, not just in the way that he's inspired me, but the way he inspired my mentor. And that's our painting for Joaquín Sorolla, and that's our painting for Rebelle Master Series. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you so much.